You know, apathy, it's such a tricky word because it can change so quickly. And I mean, that was one of the things that was so amazing about what happened in this city in 1999, right? Because all we ever heard in the 90s was how apathetic young people were. And I remember when I was writing No Logo, which was a book about anti-corporate branding and also young people engaging in anti-corporate activism, I couldn't find an American publisher. And you know, Rick was mentioning our mutual friend, my editor at Picador, but that was the only publishing house that would take No Logo, because every single publisher in the U.S. told me that they were really interested in it and that they cared about it, but that young people today are so apathetic. And I remember this one editor at Knopf in New York said to me, you know, I'm really interested in world politics, but young people in America want to read memoirs of eating disorders. And then when the Seattle protests happened, she called me. She's like, do you have any other books that you're writing? No, just simply in terms of the disillusionment around voting, I mean, I think what we suffer from more is less apathy than learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is actually, you know, it's a psychological phrase based on these weird experiments that they did on dogs, where, does people know what I'm referring to? The learned helplessness. Yeah. No, but I mean, if you get zapped and you try to escape and you can't escape, then you stop trying, right? You know, think about the 2006 midterm elections, right? I mean, if people don't want to vote in the next presidential elections after that experience, it's not because they're apathetic, it's because they've been learning helplessness, right? So I think, you know, a lot of it also has to do with telling each other our victory stories as well. You know, I think that one of the most disempowering, you know, we sometimes think the media doesn't do a good enough job of telling us how bad things are. And I really started to think that the bigger problem is that we never hear success stories. You know, we never hear about people who did organize their, you know, Starbucks outlet, or, you know, or an indigenous group in Ecuador that successfully kicked out a mining company. You know, we'll hear about the mining companies and, you know, the despoiling of land. You know, that's the kind of story that actually does get out once in a while. But you almost never hear about the victories. Because they actually challenge that. So I think that's part of it. I'll come back to that question. I mean, the only thing I would just add to that, you know, is I really totally agree that this is the huge push. This is the education and Social Security are the next frontiers for total privatization. And, you know, I've referred to disaster zones as laboratories for what they want to do all the time and everywhere. Milton Friedman wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal 3 months after the levees broke. He said, teachers and parents and students are scattered all over the United States. The city lies in ruins. This is a tragedy. It is also an opportunity to radically remake the education system. And then he proceeded, to prescribe privatization of the public school system, which ended up being picked up by the charter school advocates. New Orleans is now the leading laboratory in the United States for charter schools. Half the students in New Orleans are going to charter schools. There used to be just 4 charter schools in New Orleans. Now I think they're around 50. And the public school system has been left to erode even more. They're completely skewing the results because these charter schools will perform better because they're excluding the most disadvantaged students in New Orleans because they can select the students that they want. So students who have very serious emotional and physical challenges, particularly because of the disaster there, are being excluded and are being dumped onto this public school system that is being starved out, while the charter schools are being showered with money from the right-wing think tanks and from Laura Bush's foundation. And, you know, the reason for that is they want these results. They want to be able to point to New Orleans, and we're going to hear it even more and more to show that this works so that they can generalize it. And I mean, the one other thing I would say is, you know, some of you may have heard me debate Alan Greenspan on Democracy Now! The other day. unfortunately, as part of the preparation for that little encounter, I had to read Alan Greenspan's book. And the overarching message of his book, you know, I mean, in that exchange, he actually said it, where I asked him whether he keeps warning about this dangerous rise of economic populism, which I just think is fantastic. But apparently Alan Greenspan thinks, you know, and keep this in mind about the apathy, Alan Greenspan thinks that there is the public is losing faith in trickle-down economics, and this is very dangerous. He's worried about it. And I asked him whether he might share some of the responsibility for this loss of faith in trickle-down economics, seeing as he presided over a period in the United States where, you know, when Reagan took office, the CEOs made 43 times as much as their workers, and when Alan Greenspan left the Federal Reserve, they made, I think, 488 times as much as their workers. And, you know, I proceeded to list the ways in which his policies had fed this: free trade, outsourcing, you know, the dot-com crash, now the subprime crash, deregulation of everything, the breaking of unions. He blamed the education system. He said that that's the reason for inequality in America. Americans are too dumb because of the bad teachers. He blamed the teachers, and he does it again and again in the book. So it's chilling, it's scary, you know, and the next time there is the slightest window of opportunity, there's going to be a radical push, a radical attack on the education system, and we have to be ready. Okay. Those are two great questions. I'm going to try not to like give a speech for each, which I easily could. All right. Project for a New American Century, you know, this is often held up, this document is often held up as sort of the smoking gun for the theory that 9/11 was an inside job, because, you know, it's signed by very many of the key players in the Bush administration, and they lay out their agenda for world domination, much of which they have achieved. But they say in the document, you know, this agenda is not possible, you know, absent an event like a new Pearl Harbor, right? So, you know, they're saying that they need a crisis to push forward with their agenda. But see, what I do in the book is I have many documents like that, from top-level economists at the World Bank, at the IMF. John Williamson, who is the person who coined the phrase the Washington Consensus and codified exactly what it is. You know, I have a quote from John Williamson saying that they've never been able to impose the Washington Consensus in the absence of a large-scale crisis. And he says, you know, given the beneficial effects of crisis, should we not consider creating a pseudo-crisis to reap the beneficial effects of reform? So there's tons of documents in which you have people anticipating or wanting a crisis in order to push forward an agenda that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. You mentioned, you know, other documents. I haven't seen the documents that you're referring to, but, you know, obviously the Third Reich practiced the Shock Doctrine and used crisis, and they aren't the only ones. I mean, in this book, I am not arguing by any means that this particular group of Chicago School economists and their, you know, the politicians who enact their policies are the first group of people in the world to exploit crisis to advance their political goals. This is the oldest trick in the book. What their use of it shows us is how deeply anti-democratic their agenda is. You know, it's not a coincidence that that the other people who spring to mind are fascists and dictators, including on the left, right? I mean, this urge to blank the slate and to start from year zero. I mean, I'm using this language very consciously. And when I start the book saying the left has been held accountable for the crimes required to impose the ugliest forms of its ideology. We have actually confronted this past. I think we've learned from this past. And I believe that that's why that when we look to Latin America and we see the rise of social movements like the Zapatistas and the MST, that participatory democracy is at the dead center of these movements. And they are building in the rubble of a failed system. This is a response to the disaster that is neoliberalism, but it's a response that is radically inclusive, that is, of course, using crisis as an opportunity, if you will, but not to blast people out of the way, as Milton Friedman was suggesting, like, yay, the teachers are away and the parents are away, we can remake the education system. But this is a crisis and an opportunity to build a more democratic, more equal society than we had before. And, Milton Friedman was very aware, his nemesis was Keynes, and he was very aware that the crisis of the Great Depression, that the market crash of 1929 had been a catalyst for progressives, for socialists, and for Keynesians to build the New Deal. And that's why they have this mission to exploit every crisis and make sure that the ideas are lying around the next time the crisis hits. That's a mission statement for the Heritage Foundation, for the American Enterprise Institute. This is not an organic intellectual movement that is bubbling up from below. It's a corporate-funded intellectual movement that makes sure that those ideas are ready to go when the next shock hits. Okay. So in terms of the motives for the players, I don't want to be flip about it, but I do, I think it's very complicated. I think it's a very rare person who can pursue very damaging policies and without some kind of intellectual framework that serves as a rationale for that activity, right? I mean, people do horrifying things. Very rarely do they do them without some claim to a higher good. I mean, it's the role that Christianity played for colonialism. And it is the role that, supremacy, a vision of racial supremacy plays. I mean, it is a belief that you are actually building something purer and better that rationalizes extraordinary violence. And once again, the same for state communists, that rationalizes it. It is the belief in utopia that rationalizes mass purges and work camps, erasing of societies. Okay, so what is free market ideology? I believe it is a rationale, okay? I don't really believe that it is, that people fall in love with the idea of trickle-down economics and then go decide to be capitalists, okay? I think that the role that trickle-down economic theory generally plays is it's like the friend you call, like after you've done something you're a little embarrassed about and they go, don't worry, you deserve it. That's Milton Friedman for the capitalist class. And I'll just give you an example because he's very much on our minds this evening. Alan Greenspan, in his autobiography, which I had absolutely no intention of plugging this evening, because I really urge you not to read it. I'm giving you the best parts, okay? In his autobiography, he talks about his own political awakening. And what's interesting is that as a student, he was a student at a time when studying economics was infused with a sense of purpose because it was after the Second World War, and there was very much a sense that Keynesianism was in vogue, and the sense was that economists, the mission was to prevent an economic crisis like the one that had happened in Germany and created the conditions for the rise of fascism. So these were very heady times for students to think about the role of economics in building social justice and in fighting dangerous forces in society. Alan Greenspan, by his own admission, couldn't have cared less, okay? He was not interested. He says he was not interested in big ideas. He was just good at math, and he was good at business, and he got his first jobs being an economic forecaster for some of the largest corporations in America. Not an ideas guy, not thinking about how to make the world a better place, okay? Even though lots of people around him were, okay? Then he stumbles across the works of Ayn Rand, okay? And has a political awakening, all right? And, you know, Ayn Rand is just pulped up Adam Smith and Milton Friedman, right? I mean, it's just, it's pulp fiction of, you know, radical capitalism, right? I mean, the climax of Atlas Shrugged, you know, somebody writes a $sign in the sky as a benediction, right? This isn't subtle stuff. There's a chapter called The Utopia of Greed, okay? And so Ayn Rand's philosophy is that greed is the governing force, the best governing force of societies, that any attempt to do good is bad and doing bad is good. And Alan Greenspan goes, yeah, and becomes a Randroid, as they were called, but which is simply to say that the role of this ideology, you know, I don't think we should give it too much respect, I guess, because for him, what he said is that he had always respected the efficiency of markets, but what Rand taught him was the morality of markets, i.e., she infused what he was already doing with this claim to a higher goal, a higher morality. So I think it's sinister. Okay, your first question about what is the international law framework for an occupying power in making, in ensuring that its economy develops. I suppose it's fairly unclear. There's only two reference points. There's the Hague Regulations and the Geneva Conventions. Those are the two pieces of international law that govern occupying powers. What they both say is that occupying powers have a responsibility to safeguard the assets of a country that they are occupying. Which is to say that, I mean, the reason why these laws exist, the heading before the section in the Hague Regulations, the little subhead is "Pillage is forbidden." You know, you think you shouldn't have to write this down, but it's a heading. Pillage is forbidden. It's my favorite part. I actually thought about calling the book "Pillage is Forbidden." Also, I thought about calling it "Freedman Fighter." You know, the point is, the reason why what Paul Bremer was doing, I mean, he was claiming that these policies were so uncontested, and this is the specialty of neoliberal economists, is to present highly ideological, highly contested policies as technocratic and uncontested, right? So they were saying that all they were doing was developing Iraq's economy and safeguarding their assets by privatizing them and, you know, laying off workers and doing everything, you know, from the Washington Consensus Handbook. But there's a lot of international lawyers came to the opinion that this was illegal under the Hague Regulations, obviously because they were privatizing the assets, and in fact this was a large part of the reason why the privatization was called off, because it was in such a legal gray zone that quite a few international lawyers, and I quoted them at the time, were saying that if an Iraqi government came to power, an elected Iraqi government came to power and decided to reverse the privatizations and expropriate these assets from the foreign companies that had bought them, that they very well could have the legal right to do it because the privatizations were illegal under international law in the first place. The analogy I used at the time in terms of what the international law says about this is that it's basically a house-sitting rule. Like an occupier is a house sitter. Like, you know, you've got to take care of the house while you're occupying it, which means you can kind of, you know, you can sleep in the bed and you can eat the food in the fridge, but you can't, you know, just bulldoze the house and turn it into condos. That's not allowed. And that is essentially what the U.S. attempted to do in Iraq. You talked about the fact that obviously there has to be a private sector role of some kind in supplying the government. You know, and when we're talking about this contractor economy, there are always going to be contractors because government's not going to make everything that it uses. It needs to, buy everything from, pencil sharpeners to, sadly, guns. And there are all kinds of rules that govern government contracting. And what the Bush administration has done is really erode that set of rules, to massively expand the contractor economy. I have a stat in the book that there were 15,000 contracts handed out for security products in 2002, and in 2005 there were 115,000. Okay, so that's and I think it's something like. The New York Times just reported on this, and I could be wrong, but I think it's something like 70% of the contracts that are being handed out are no bid, right? So, I mean, the bidding is one of the ways that you try to have some accountability. But then the other framework for government contracting is that, because this is not part of the free market economy, because it's an entirely, it is a state economy, the contractor economy. It actually gives the government a great deal of control to make all kinds of demands of their contractors. So you can demand a higher level of you can demand that contractors pay better wages than normal corporations working in the private sector, because if these corporations are going to be getting, making their business from public money, the public can make demands of those contractors, and that's why you have something like the Davis-Bacon, which says that any government contractor has to pay prevailing wages, not the minimum wage, but prevailing wages. And this was one of the first things that Bush changed after Hurricane Katrina. It was the first piece of legislation that he passed was to say that contractors working in New Orleans didn't have to pay prevailing wage, and that's why there was a huge amount of migrant workers who came to New Orleans to do that reconstruction work and were paid just slave level wages, and had huge debts that they had paid to labor contractors to get there in the first place. So yeah, there's all kinds of things that can be done. They are systematically being dismantled. I mean, in Iraq, you could have said to the Halliburtons and Bechtels, and I have to say I hate talking about this because I really, the war was illegal. It failed because it was an illegal war, and Iraq is owed massive reparations. So I really don't like to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of if they had occupied them more better, it would have been okay. I mean, I don't think it ever could have been okay. But that said, I mean, if you look at the state holds all the cards in a contractor economy. It has the contracts, and it can put whatever conditions it wants on the corporations that are getting these contracts, because it is not in the private sector. So in Iraq, there could have been a rule that Bechtel had to hire 100% Iraqis to do the work in Iraq, which would have made a huge difference in that country, because a large amount of the rage had to do with watching foreigners come in and take these jobs that Iraqis could have performed themselves. So, there's all kinds of things that you can do that weren't done, because the theory behind it was simply that you just create the conditions for the most profits to be made, and the country will just rebuild itself on the, the creative cauldron of capitalism. So the question about the Ford Foundation, I do have a section in the book. I'm not going to get into it in great depth now about the role of the Ford Foundation in funding the human rights movement in Latin America. The Ford Foundation had also funded the Chicago Boys. They were the major funders besides the U.S. State Department. And so there was a real irony in Latin America, because the Ford Foundation had played such a key role in training the economists who had worked with the dictatorships and imposing these brutal policies. But then the Ford Foundation also funded many of the lawyers who tried to get people out of jail. And what I argue in the book is that this created a strange specialization where the human rights movement really couldn't ask why this violence was happening, and it was very legalistic and narrow. And it's part of the reason why you had like the sort of economic strain, and then you had the human rights strain of activism in this region, and they were never allowed to intersect. And I say in the book, these contradictions are so stark that in 1976, Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize for policies that were being implemented with blood and fire in Latin America. And in 1977, Amnesty International won the Nobel Prize for their crusading work in Argentina and Chile, cleaning up after Milton Friedman's policies. The question was about I think the question of whether foundations have a demobilizing effect on progressive movements in the United States. And I would have to say, I think that in general, the professionalization of activism and the replacing of activism with an aid framework can be very, very dangerous. And I think we really see this really clearly in disaster zones, where you have moments. I was just in New Orleans on the second anniversary of the levees breaking. I was there for this extraordinary exchange that was organized by a wonderful NGO called ActionAid International. And ActionAid International does a lot of great work critiquing the NGO, what in New Orleans they call the NGO industrial complex. They had facilitated this wonderful exchange between community organizers in Tamil Nadu, India, who had been fighting land grabs after the tsunami, an exchange between those amazing organizers who represented movements sometimes of 50,000 people, just huge movements in India, and they brought them to New Orleans to meet with community organizers in New Orleans. And a group from New Orleans had also gone to India, and so this was a really interesting exchange where they were talking about disaster capitalism and how it manifested itself in their respective countries. But the delegates from India, we were touring the lower Ninth Ward and looking at, what had happened there. And you see, there's no water, the homes have just been leveled, and the weeds are growing, and nothing's happened. And one of the organizers from India turned to me and said, if this happened in India, we'd have a revolution. And in thinking about why there wasn't more of a revolt in New Orleans, a lot of people pointed to the role of the foundations and the NGOs as a demobilizing force. This was a moment of rage and rebellion, and it should have been, because this was a theft of a city. It was an armed robbery. And the sort of and that rage, that was a radical and important and well-deserved rage, was dampened down, by this infrastructure that descended on the city and on the, the shelters around it, of just keeping everybody waiting for like the potential of some sort of charity that was going to fix everything. And of course, in 99% of the cases, the charity really didn't come, and the homes weren't rebuilt. But that moment kind of drained away. And I've seen that dampening down impact. And I don't think it's really a grand conspiracy, but I do think that at high levels of government, there is an understanding that it's way better to have NGOs than it is to have social movements that are a hell of a lot harder to control. I will end on that note. Thank you. Thank you so much.